Welcome back to the Daily Drum on WHUR and Sirius XM Channel 141. This is the Insight segment. I'm Harold Fisher. Tonight, after months of build-up and preparation, the Trump military parade is now in the history books, but the pushback and the criticism are far from over. Organizers of the No Kings protests say their rallying call will continue. Also, civil rights groups are vowing to keep up the pressure on the Trump administration, ramping up the fight against the big, beautiful bill and the ICE raids. Meantime, there are calls from both sides of the political aisles to bring down the temperature on the political rhetoric in the face of the deadly attacks over the weekend in Minnesota. We have a lot to talk about tonight. My guest is Demelza Bayer, Director of Public Policy at the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law. Ms. Bayer, thank you so much for joining this conversation on this really important day. Let's start with Minnesota. And obviously, for those who may or may not be familiar, the Lawyers Committee is nonpartisan, nonprofit. But from your vantage point, how would you assess the climate in the U.S. when it comes to the political discourse?
Well, thank you so much for having me on the show today. This has been both a heavy, weighty past couple of days and a really significant one. We are, of course, extremely saddened, and our hearts go out to the family of Representative Melissa Hortman, her husband, and the other state senator and his wife who were seriously injured, being shot multiple times by this would-be assassin who killed Representative Hortman. This is a really heavy time. We've seen over the past several years, dating back to Charlottesville, an increase in violence, an increase in rhetoric among our elected politicians, including President Trump, that has resulted in a really kind of astounding period of political violence in our country. And this can't be normalized. You know, we live in a democracy, and we have a country where people can have different points of view, and everyone has a right to their viewpoint. But getting to the point of violence is really a scary point to be at. And just to zoom out a little bit, in terms of what's happening in DC, when it comes to both providing resources for communities in the wake of violence. There has been a slashing of grants the Department of Justice gives out to states and cities, towns around the country that provide things like victim services, that provide resources for people who've been impacted by hate crimes. Those have been cut pretty much across the board, with rare exceptions. And so, there's a strong connection between actions that are taken both in DC and beyond, and things that happen around our country. But this is definitely a heavy, weighty moment where it really is important for all of our rights and liberties, for everyone to be able to express their opinion without fear of violence. And that includes elected officials, and includes you and I, and everyone in the country.
Well, let's talk a little bit about that, since you brought it up. What might that portend for the future as it relates to addressing some of the issues of violence in this country? Certainly, political violence is, we obviously, communities may be struggling with various and sundry kinds of crime, but political violence, as horrible as it is, some may consider it separate from the other kinds of things that you spoke about. But then again, maybe not.
Well, one thing I'll say, just as like a level setting, because there's been a lot of rhetoric about the increase in violent crime in the United States. And actually, violent crime has been going down for the past several years. That includes murders and other types of violent crime. So we've seen a decrease overall in violent crime. Particularly, some cities have seen dramatic drops in violent crime. So I just want to put that as a level setter, because there has been a lot of both rhetoric and actions allegedly to address, risks of violence, even from the peaceful protests that we've seen happening across the country, including in Los Angeles. But in terms of political violence and hate crimes and other things that we've seen that have been targeted, it has been a really concerning increase. And one of the at the Lawyers Committee, we have the James Byrd Center to Stop Hate, and our center has worked on combating hate crimes, including sometimes partnering with local communities on trainings and other things to educate law enforcement about best practices. But it really is something that takes work at the national level, but also at the state and local level, to both be very careful about rhetoric and how people are discussed, including by elected officials, groups of people and communities, but also just having, promoting understanding and openness and dialogues in community is really important. And also just being aware that, what we have seen, unfortunately, in the country, and you can see this sometimes happen with both hate crimes and some of the politically motivated attacks, has been we've seen a rise in extremism and a rise in a lot of white supremacist activity in the United States.
Well, and I think sometimes Americans have very short memories, because we only have to go back to April when the Pennsylvania governor's home was firebombed. And then we can go back to 8 years ago during the congressional baseball game, where the House members were targeted, and we know that Steve Scalise was permanently injured by someone who had left-leaning politics. And so, again, this rhetoric seems to have just risen to a level that some may argue we have not seen in a really, really long time in this country. And we did hear, of course, during the talk shows over the weekend, on the Sunday morning talk shows, that that lawmakers are obviously afraid, but they're also speaking out about the need to really cool this down.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we can't continue on this path. We've gone through periods in our country where we've had political violence before, going back to you think about the assassination of President Lincoln, you think about all the attacks that happened during Reconstruction under the Black Codes. You think about what happened during the 1960s and the assassinations of Dr. King and RFK. We do have, a history, but we had been on for a good decades long track of reducing politically motivated violence in the country. And part of that goes to, we are a diverse, multiracial, multi-ethnic country with people from everywhere in the world, all different viewpoints. And the way for us to, reduce the risk of violence and reduce the risk of extremism is for us to not only, have the rhetoric not be incendiary, but also to promote understanding and acceptance of other people and respect for other people's rights, even if, regardless of who they are, regardless if they come from another country, or if they're a different sexual orientation or a different race, and also respect for rights and all of our individual rights, including our First Amendment right to, express our opinion and criticize the government. But all of our rights, and that involves that's really a tone that's set by elected officials, but also, other leaders throughout the country. So it really will take, a significant sea change, but hopefully we can stem this tide of political violence we've seen that's been particularly serious for the past several years.
If you could, if you don't mind talking just a little bit more about what the Lawyers Committee is doing to address domestic extremism, and who's the audience, and how do you know that your work is effective?
Well, we've worked on addressing extremism for many years now, doing different things. We have, for instance, advocated for legislation like the COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act, which included the WHUR-FM No Hate Act, which would improve things like reporting of hate crimes and collecting good data on hate crimes, so the FBI can even track, what's happening across the country in different states and communities. We've also advocated and worked with other groups on responding to hate crimes when they've happened. We've advocated, for instance, after the awful hate crime that happened in Buffalo a couple years ago at the supermarket.
Mm-hmm.
We advocated for a thorough investigation by the federal government, by DOJ, for resources for the community in Buffalo. And after we see any sort of hate crime or attack, we will advocate for a thorough, a serious, robust investigation for resources for that community. And we'll stay in touch with the community. One of the things that we've done over the years are doing, trainings for impacted communities, for law enforcement and for nonprofits, and also advocating for resources for those communities in terms of grants, so that people locally in the community, like nonprofits, can have access to resources. One of the things we also advocated for when we were advocating for full implementation of President Biden's executive order on policing, which has been rescinded by President Trump. But that executive order incentivized state and local law enforcement to do a number of things, implement a number of improvements, such as certain use of force policies and restrictions on things like chokeholds. And one of the ways they were incentivizing state and local law enforcement to implement the executive order, because it applied to all federal law enforcement, but state and local was discretionary, was through grants. And one of the things that we advocated for was that for a state or local police department to qualify for the additional grant funding, that they would do things like report hate crimes, which has been, sorely underreported for decades in the United States. Some states would go years with reporting zero hate crimes, even though there were news media reports of things happening in local cities and towns.
Certainly lots to talk about, but I do need to take a break because there's so many things, and I don't want to miss the point of we as we even look forward. I do want to take a look back at and just kind of what happened this weekend about the protests, the march, the optics of all of those things. So please stay with us. And we also want to remind our listeners that you can hear this and every edition of the Daily Drum Inside segment via podcast on WHUR.com. The Original Quiet Storm with Raheem Devon is next on WHUR. This conversation continues on Sirius XM channel 141 and 96.3 HD2 in just a few seconds. Welcome back to the Daily Drum on WHUR and Sirius XM channel 141. I'm Harold Fisher. We continue our conversation about the politics and the protests after a very eventful weekend here in America. My guest is Demelza Bayer, Director of Public Policy at the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law. Let's talk, as I said before the break, about the weekend in DC, and kind of the split screen of the parade and the protest. Um, there weren't a lot of hiccups as it relates to the parade, but we saw tens of thousands of counter demonstrations across the country. There have been estimates that range anywhere from 5 to 8 million people participating. Just talk to me a little bit about the optics of this weekend and the parade and the protests.
Yes, it was certainly a huge contrast because there was this military parade held, which is a very rare occurrence in the United States, ostensibly to celebrate the 250th anniversary of the Army, but coinciding with President Trump's 79th birthday. And this parade, by the way, at the cost of at least $45 million, including to repair damage to DC streets from having the military equipment come down the street at a time when the DC government is facing huge, almost $1 billion cut to its budget based on recent congressional action that hasn't been remedied. And you contrast that at the same time with having, I think, at least 5 million people participated in more than 2,000 of the No Kings protests across the country, both in cities, large cities. I think the main event was in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and then in cities like from tiny towns in states to large cities, rallies and marches of all sizes, bringing together a diverse group of people who were united by a concern that we have been taking a number of steps towards authoritarianism under President Trump. And there is a certain, kind of irony, because if you think about the founding of our country and why you had the American Revolution and the Declaration of Independence, it was a time when the King of England was sending troops who were throughout cities in the country, cities like Philadelphia, like New York, like Baltimore, had troops from England stationed in there, and there wasn't any accountability, that people had no rights. And now we're facing a time where you see a huge disconnect, where the executive has overreached in a number of ways, and there have been court decisions that have ruled things to be unconstitutional or illegal across many things, not just immigration enforcement. And so it is a contrast. It is a big contrast thinking about celebrating the creation of our army, and you think about why our country was founded. And it was founded on everyone wanting to have the power being with the people of the country and not put in one person, including the president.
Yeah, and even in kind of watching, the events, and certainly I always caution our listeners, when we are in the times of AI and Photoshop, and unless you were downtown in DC, you may not know exactly what things looked like. But I think it is safe to say that the attendance for the parade was moderate. It was not overwhelming, and that could be, that one could say that is because either the president is not as popular as perhaps he thought he was, or it could have just been the fact that it was just difficult to get downtown because of all of the fencing, or it could be the weather. There could be a great many reasons, but one thing we do know is that, as you were talking about before, the millions of people who are upset about a great many things, including the ICE protests, as we saw in Salt Lake City, we saw in Los Angeles, and many of the other places. And I think with that said, the president did double down when he was at a brief press conference just this morning with the Canadian Prime Minister, that he is going to be ramping up even more ICE raids, arrests in mostly Democratic cities. What message does that send as we look at just kind of where we are right now?
I think it's a chilling message, because I think that one, these raids that are happening are not actually targeting people who've committed any crime. These are raids that are happening in workplaces of all types, not just farms and the hospitality industry. They're happening in any kind of workplace. They're also now ICE is now going into places like hospitals and schools that used to be considered off limits for enforcement because we didn't want to discourage people from sending their children to school, including their American citizen children, or it discouraged people from seeking medical help when they needed it, or discourage people from bringing their own family members who need emergency help. But we're seeing kind of all of the old rules and understandings and protections fall away, and we've seen a substantial number of ICE raids. And then in response to that, there have been protests, peaceful protests. And then in response to those peaceful protests, we've seen the sending in of thousands of National Guard troops and 700 Marines to the city of Los Angeles. And, that's concerning for a number of reasons. First off, that the governor of California, Gavin Newsom, and the mayor of Los Angeles, Karen Bass, did not want this additional military presence. They have a very large and professional police force that is experienced at managing protests. And the last time in our country that you saw the president send in federal troops when it wasn't asked for the governor goes back decades, to where you saw the governor refusing to enforce a desegregation order in the South. So this is a very different circumstance. This is a situation where you have people peacefully protesting because they have seen their neighbors, including people with no criminal record, pillars of the community, parents of multiple U.S. citizen children, often being swept up and detained. And it's affecting people around the country. It's affecting people. It's affecting families. It's affecting U.S. citizens who have some family members who are undocumented. And now it's affecting the business community. And we've seen the response from people like the farming community who, are expressing deep concern about these raids and how it's going to impact their ability to feed the country, because they're taking away long-term employees without any ties to any committing any crime other than just being undocumented.
And I was about to mention that because the president mentioned just a few days ago, apparently he is hearing from the hospitality community, the business community, the farmers, that he spoke about a possible, carve out for the agricultural workers, a carve out for hospitality workers. But again, there's this confusion, for lack of a better term, and I think that's that's fair. Where when you just look at the broad scope of what these ICE raids were originally supposed to do pre-election, which was just to get the criminals out, and then you're getting all of the people who are undocumented out. Oh, but wait a minute, but if it's going to hurt American businesses, then let's do a carve out for that. It is a hodgepodge. It is a mess, and I think what can people kind of make of it? Is this just kind of where we are ahead of midterms, ahead of the next election? Is there any, for lack of a better way to say it, is there any light at the end of the tunnel for those who may be vulnerable?
That's a great question. I think that the most important thing people can do is continue to speak up, and that can mean going to protests, that can mean contacting your legislators, that can and your legislators, both your federal, members of Congress, your senators, your representative, but also people locally so that they know what's going on. Is breaking apart communities and families. But I will say that, just to highlight, unfortunately, for the No Kings protests across the country, they were, obviously the immigration rates have been a huge flashpoint, but we're also facing the budget reconciliation bill, which is literally, in my entire career, I have never seen a bill that would cause this much harm to this many millions of Americans in one bill. We're talking about a bill that would result in millions of Americans losing their health insurance through Medicaid, including, children, disproportionately people of color, but we're also just talking a huge portion of Americans, period. We're also talking about a bill that would be the largest cut to SNAP, supplemental food aid, in our nation's history. That would again result in many children, millions of children and adults with disabilities losing access to food aid, and having food aid cut down to about $5 a day, which does not even buy a carton of eggs often in the current economy. And we're talking about a bill that, would make access to college and graduate school out of reach for millions of Americans. Being mindful that WHUR is at Howard, just to highlight, we're looking at this bill would end subsidized undergraduate federal student loans. So everyone would have to pay interest while they're in school. It would cap your federal aid for undergraduate at $50,000. And I can just say there's many schools right now in the United States that 1 year is more than $50,000 when you add in room and board, tuition, the full cost of attendance. This would cap it for the entire 4 years. It would also restrict Pell Grant funding and require, to get Pell Grant, that you be half-time or more, which I think we all know there's people who go to college, a course here, a course there, because they don't have the money. They're working full time while going to school, or they're caring for their children or their parents or another family member. So they really don't have the option of going, half time or full time. It would also create additional barriers in terms of ending unemployment and economic hardship deferments for people in repayment. It would push everyone into just 2 repayment options once you're paying your student loans, and it would end a lot of the subsidized programs and different repayment options we have today. So it would really be devastating for access to education. The bill also has some very concerning provisions with regard to, the executive overreach, including a provision that would require bond being posted when someone is challenging the federal government for an unconstitutional action or violation. Most of the times these lawsuits the judges do not require bond, because most people don't have millions of dollars to pay in bond before they file suit against the federal government of the United States. And this would basically prevent federal judges from enforcing injunctions, whether they're preliminary or permanent, or contempt of court, other actions against federal officials in the federal government, unless the person who filed the lawsuit posts a huge amount of bond, which could be substantial, because we're talking about a lot at stake with the entire federal government.
I did want to ask about the Lawyers Committee and the other civil rights groups that condemned the LA ICE raids, and as well as, kind of the the aggressive response to the LA protesters. Can you talk to us a little bit about the statement that the committee put out and what has happened since?
Yes, we were proud to stand with a number of other civil rights organizations across the spectrum speaking out against the raids, the way that they've been happening, and also the militarized response to the protesters. This is something where we've continued to work in close coalition, and we represent a spectrum of different constituencies, but this is really an American issue. What's happening right now is not just affecting people who are undocumented or people who've immigrated to the United States. The way that law enforcement is being used against communities of color has deep impacts for Americans, including U.S. citizens. One, we've already seen racial profiling increase. We've seen U.S. citizens be detained because they do not have evidence of their citizenship on them, and then have to be released after, producing a birth certificate or a passport, which I don't know about you, but I don't travel around with my birth certificate or my passport on me.
Although I have considered it. I say that tongue in cheek, but suffice it to say that I do have friends who are born here, friends who are, for example, Puerto Ricans who are U.S. citizens, friends who are from the U.S. Virgin Islands, but these people have accents. Okay. They do not consider it tongue in cheek or even remotely funny that they have passports, and they have decided that they will travel with their passports are in their cars. So that is not too far-fetched, but I interrupted you. Please continue.
No, that's a good point. And I actually lived in St. Croix in the U.S. Virgin Islands for a period of time, and have a lot of love for the U.S. Virgin Islands, also for Puerto Rico, also for all of the territories where you have so much patriotism. You have people serving in the armed forces at higher rates than the mainland, and not being able to have the full rights and full benefits. And so I think that is a real concern. And I think it is a real concern in the country that people don't necessarily even realize that immigration enforcement happens in a much broader swath of the country. It's not literally just at the border. It goes substantially in on both sides of our border. So a majority of the United States population lives in zones of the country in which immigration enforcement is heightened. And so the concern we have is that it's really important for law enforcement to be structured in a way that promotes positive relationships between the community and the police, for there to be trust. But we have seen in terms of the federal ICE agents going into all sorts of protected places, it is impacting people's lives, particularly in border states, but going in broader. There's a cautiousness, and that is having huge impacts. And we've also seen that with law enforcement, there's a erosion of trust if people don't feel like they can move around freely without worrying that an ICE agent or someone is going to stop them when they're driving their car with their kids home from work, or they're going to a school play, or going to their work and just being picked up and stopped. And so that is a real concern. And, we've seen, unfortunately, that in the country, when immigration enforcement becomes aggressive, it does have spillover effects into the policing dynamics as well. And although there are separations between local law enforcement and federal immigration enforcement, we've also seen, a very aggressive approach by ICE. And we've seen things like, different agents going into various different locations. And there's really an erosion of like the community sense of safety. and people's feeling like they have the ability to move about freely, which should be something that we all take for granted.
On that point, are you also concerned that not everyone who shows up in a uniform is who they say they are? Because we have seen many people who you can order a police uniform or a police emblem and tactical gear online. That's not hard. And are you concerned that some of the people who are coming up and snatching people who maybe, I emphasize maybe, undocumented, and these people are not affiliated with law enforcement at all?
I think that when you're referencing the law enforcement outfit, obviously the man they just apprehended for the murder of Representative Hortman, her husband, and the attempted murder of the other representative and his wife, he was apparently dressed up as a law enforcement agent, and can't speculate about how big of a risk that poses, but I think that it is deeply concerning, and I think that it goes to, we should live in a country where we're able to have certain protections and certain securities, and I think we're still learning the full circumstance of what happened, but it's deeply, deeply concerning.
And not even the events of the weekend, but what I refer to specifically, because there have been some reporting and some of the major news organizations where you have guys who are dressed up with masks who are picking up agricultural workers or what have you, but they have not identified themselves, and that's what I refer to.
Oh yes, yeah. There's been an issue, and this was the issue at Tufts University when the student was taken, where the ICE agents were wearing masks and they weren't necessarily identifiable. It wasn't clear that they were actually law enforcement or who they were. That's deeply that's a serious issue, because people should be able to, if law enforcement is interacting with them, they should be able to see their face, they should be able to see their badge, see who they're seeing, like a nameplate, so they know who they are and have some sort of verification. It is really concerning that you've seen instances of people being literally snatched in the streets. I mean, this is not the United States that I've known, where people have to worry about like being seized in broad daylight by unidentified men wearing masks.
The other thing, and I think this is a critical issue, even outside the events of this weekend, but more broadly, what has happened with the DOJ since January, particularly the Civil Rights Office within DOJ and the changes that have been made. How has that impacted the work that the Lawyers Committee is trying to do with the Office of Civil Rights and the DOJ pretty much rendered impotent?
Yeah, it's been quite shocking, because due to a variety of factors, including the abrupt turnabout away from enforcing our nation's civil rights laws, the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice has lost over 70% of their attorneys and almost all of their staff. And the consequences for that are pretty devastating for the entire country, because the Civil Rights Division enforces all sorts of laws, discrimination law, employment discrimination laws, disability rights discrimination laws, the voting, if there's a denial of the right to vote, or there's discriminatory barriers put up to the right to vote. there's laws being enforced based on housing discrimination.
Mm.
And so there's a huge broad spectrum. There's also rights being enforced to protect people who are in custodial situations, like people who are in federal prison and being discriminated against, like not being allowed to practice their religion freely, or facing other threats of violence. There's a huge range of enforcement that had been situated in the Civil Rights Division at DOJ, and they had also coordinated with a bunch of the other agencies on enforcing rights, like, for instance, coordinating with Department of Education on enforcing the civil rights of students in school, K-12 and college students. And the consequences of the loss of the institutional memory and the people who had been serving for decades in the Civil Rights Division, who were civil servants who had served under many Republican and Democratic presidents, is huge. And this loss will be felt not just now, but literally at least for a decade or two, because rebuilding that department will take that long. And the unfortunate thing is that while organizations like the Lawyers Committee and our sister civil rights organizations have been trying to step up, and I know there's several state AGs who've tried to step up and fill the void that has been left by DOJ retreating, including withdrawing from some ongoing cases.
Mm-hmm.
Just to be frank, though, it's impossible to fill that void, because we're talking about hundreds of lawyers who were doing basic bread and butter civil rights work on behalf of the American people, that are just suddenly no longer there, and with a very, very different mission for the department being carried out.
Demelza Baer with the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law. Thank you so much. We could talk about this for hours, certainly, and there's so many other issues that are going to be coming our way, but we will continue to watch and continue to discuss this. Thank you so much for spending some time with us. I appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
Sure thing. That is the Daily Drum for Monday, June 16th. I'm Harold Fisher. Good night.